I am Lady Rain, Reader's Nook, Part 2, Chapter 6 of the Tom. 1. The disappearance of David Brown rendered Ruth's plan obsolete. After David disappeared, she found herself unable to leave town. Because David was gone, they all knew it. They also knew David was somewhere still in Haven. Always during the becoming came a time which might have been called the Dance of Truth. For Haven, this time commenced with the disappearance of David Brown and unfolded itself during the subsequent search. Ruth was just sitting down to the local news. Phone rang. Marie Brown was hysterical, barely coherent. "Calm down, Marie," Ruth said. Thought it was good she had eaten an early supper. She might not get another chance to eat for quite a while. At first, the only clear fact she seemed able to get from Marie was that her boy David was in some kind of trouble. Trouble that had started the backyard magic show, and Hilly had gotten hysterical. "Put Bryant on," Ruth said. "But you'll come, won't you?" Marie wept. "Please, after dark, we can still find..." Excuse me, I get the hiccups. "We can still find him. I know we can. Oh my goodness. Why do I have the hiccups? Oh, good gracious. That was... Of course I'll come," Ruth said. "Now put Bryant on." Bryant was dazed, but able to give a clearer picture of what had happened. It still sounded crazy, but then, what else was new in Haven these days? After the magic show, the audience had wandered away, leaving Hilly and David to clean up. Now David was gone. Hilly had fainted, and now had no memory of what had happened that afternoon at all. All he knew for sure was that when he saw David, he would give him all the G.I. Joes, but he didn't remember why. You better come quick as you can," Bryant said. Going out, paused for a moment on her way to the Dart and looked at Haven Village's main street with real hate. "What have you done now?" she thought. "Damn you, what have you done now?" 2. With only 2 hours of good daylight left, Ruth wasted no time. She gathered Bryant, Ev Hillman, John Golden, from just down the road, and Henry Applegate, Barney's father, in the Browns' backyard. Marie wanted to join the search party, but Ruth insisted that she stay with Hilly. In her current frame of mind, Marie would be more an hindrance than help. They had already searched, of course, but they had gone at it in a distracted, half-assed way. Eventually, as the boys' parents became convinced that David must have wandered across the road and into the woods, they had really ceased to search at all. Although they had continued to move aimlessly around. Ruth got some from what they said, some from the oddly distracted, oddly frightened way they looked, most from their minds. Their 2 minds, the human one and the alien one. Always there came a point where the becoming might degenerate into madness. The madness of schizophrenia as the target minds tried to fight the alien group mind, slowly wielding them together, and then eclipsing them. This was the time of necessary acceptance. Thus, it was the time of the dance of untruth. Mabel Noyes might have set it going, but she was not loved enough to make people dance. The Hillmans and Browns were. They went far back in Haven's history, were well loved and well respected. Of course, David Brown was only a little boy. The human net mind, it's Ruth's mind, one might say, thought he could have wandered into the high grass of Brown's back field and fallen asleep, more likely than Marie's idea that he went into the woods. He'll have to cross a road to do that, and he was well behaved. Marie and Bryant both said so. More important, so did the others. He'd been told again and again and again that he was never to cross the road without a grown-up. So the woods don't seem likely. "We're going to cover the lawn and backfield section by section," Ruth said. "And we're not going to walk around. We're going to look." "But if we don't find him," Bryant's eyes were scared and pleading. "If we don't find him, Ruth?" She didn't really have to tell him. She only had to think it to Adam. If they didn't find David quickly, she would begin making calls. There would be a larger search party, men with lights and bullhorns moving through the woods. If David wasn't found by morning, she would call Orville Davidson up in Unity and have him bring his bloodhound. This was a familiar enough procedure to most of them. They knew about search parties. They must have been on them before. They were common enough during hunting season, when the woods filled up with out-of-staters carrying their heavy caliber weapons and wearing their orange flannel duds from LL Beans. Usually these lost were found alive, suffering from nothing but mild exposure and severe embarrassment. Sometimes they found them dead, and sometimes they never found them at all. They would not find David Brown. They knew it long before the search began. Their minds had netted together as soon as Ruth arrived. There was an act of instinct, as voluntary as a blink. They linked minds and searched for David's. Their mental voices united in chorus so strong that if David had been in a radius of 70 miles, he would have clapped his hands to his head and screamed in pain. He would have heard and known they were looking for him at 5 times that distance. No, David Brown was not lost. He was just not there. The search they were preparing to make was totally useless. But because it was the Tommyknockers' mind which knew this, and because they had thought of themselves as human beings, they would begin the dance of untruth. The becoming would demand many lies. This one, the only one they told themselves, the one that insisted they were really the same as ever, was the most important lie of all. They all knew that too, even Ruth McCausland. 3. By 8:30, with dusk growing too thick to be much different from night, the 5 searchers had grown to a dozen. The news traveled quickly, a little too quickly to be normal. They covered all the yards and fields on the Browns' side, beginning at Hilly's stage. Ruth herself had crawled under there with a powerful flashlight, thinking that if David Brown was anywhere close by, it should be here, fast asleep. But there was only flattened grass, and the queer electrical smell that made her wrinkle her nose, and expanding the hunt outward in a beam shape from there. "You think he's in the woods, Ruth?" Casey Trimman asked. "He must be," she answered tiredly. Her head ached again. David was not there. No more in the woods than the President of the United States was, all the same. In the back of her mind, tongue twisters chased each other as restlessly as squirrels running on a wire exercise wheels. The dusk was not so thick she couldn't see Bryant Brown, put a hand to his face, turn away from the others. There was a moment of awkward silence, which Ruth finally broke. "We need more men." "State cops, Ruth?" Casey asked. She saw them all looking at her, their faces still and sober. "No, Ruth, no. Outsiders, no outsiders. We'll take care of this business. We don't need outsiders while we shed our skins, put on our new skins while we become. If he's in the woods, we'll hear him. He'll call with his mind. No outsiders, Ruth. Shh, shh, your life. We all love you. No outsiders." These voices ringing in her mind, rising in the still, humid dark. She looked and saw only dark shapes and white faces. Shapes and faces that for a moment barely seemed human. "How many of you still have teeth?" Ruth McCausland thought hysterically. She opened her mouth, thinking she might scream, but her voice sounded, at least to her own ears, normal and natural. Her mind, tongue twisters. Pretty Patsy picked some, Betty bitter, fought some, turned faster than ever. "I don't think we need them just now, Casey, do you?" Casey looked at her a little puzzled. "But I guess that'd be up to you, Ruth." "Fine," she said. "Henry, John, you others, make some calls." I want 50 wood-wise men and women here before we go in. Everyone who shows up at the Browns has got to have a flashlight with him, or he's not going near those woods. We've got a little boy lost. We don't need to add any grown-up men or women." As she spoke, authority grew in her voice. Shaky fear lessened. They looked at her respectfully. "I'll call Adley McKean and Dick Allison. Try and go back and tell Marie to put on lots of coffee. It's going to be a long night." They moved off in different directions. The men who had calls to make headed in the direction of Henry Applegate's house. The Browns was nearer, but the situation had become worse, and none of them wanted to go there just now. Not while Bryant was telling his wife, Ruth McCausland, had decided their 4-year-old son was probably lost in the not there. Big woods after all. Ruth was overwhelmed with weariness. She wished she could believe she was just going mad. She could believe that. Everything would be easier. "Ruth?" She looked up. Ev Hillman was standing there, his thin, white hair flying around his skull. He looked troubled and afraid. Billy's doped off again. His eyes are open, but shrugged. "Very sorry," Ruth said. "I'm taking him to Derry. Bryant and Marie want to stay here, of course. Why not Doc Warwick to start with? Derry seems a better idea, that's all." Ev looked at Ruth unwinkingly. His eyes were old man eyes, red-rimmed, roomy. Their blue faded to something which was almost no color at all. Faded, but not stupid. And Ruth suddenly realized, with a wallop of excitement that nearly rocked her head back to her neck, on her neck, that she could barely read him at all. Whatever was happening here in Haven, Ev, like Bobby's friend, was exempt. It was going on around him, and he knew about it, some, but he was not part of it. She felt an excitement which was followed by bitter envy. "I think he'll be better off out of town, don't you, Ruthie?" "Yes," she said slowly, thinking of those rising voices, thinking of the last time of how David was not there, and then pushing the lunatic idea away forever. Of course he was. Were they not human? They were. But yes, I suppose you will. You could come with us, Ruthie." She looked at him for a long time. "Did Hilly do something, Ev? I see his name in your head. Can't see anything else, just that, winking on and off like a neon sign." He looked at her, seemingly unsurprised by her tacit admission that she, sensible Ruth McCausland, was either reading his mind or believed she was. Maybe. He acts like he did. This half swoon he's in. If that's what it is. Could be he did something he's sorry for now. So, it wasn't his fault, Ruthie. Whatever's going on here in Haven, that was what really did it. Screen door banged. She looked out over toward the Applegates and saw several men on their way back. Ev glanced around and then looked back at Ruth. "Come with us, Ruth." "And leave my town? Ev, I can't." "All right. If Hilly should remember, get in touch with me," she said. "If I can," Ev muttered. "They can make it tough, Ruthie." "Yes," Ruth said. "I know they can." "They're coming, Ruth," Henry Applegate said, and fixed Ev Hillman with a cold, praising look. "Lots of good folks." "Fine," Ruth said. Ev looked unwinkingly back at Applegate for a moment, and then moved away. An hour or so later, while Ruth was organizing the searchers and getting them ready for their first sweep, she saw Ev's old Valiant back down the Browns' driveway and turned toward Bangor. A small, dark shape, Billy, was propped up in the passenger seat, a department store mannequin. Good luck, you two, Ruth thought. She wished achingly she was also on her way out of this feverish nightmare. When the old man's car disappeared over the first hill, Ruth looked around and saw some 25 men and a half a dozen women, some on this side of the road, some on the other. They were all standing motionless, simply watching, loving her. Again, she thought their shapes were changing, twisting, becoming inhuman. They were becoming all right. They were becoming something she didn't even dare think of. So was she. "What are you gawking at?" she called out, too shrilly. "Come on, let's try to find David Brown." 4. They didn't find him that night, nor on Monday. There was a hot, white, beating silence. Bobbi Anderson and her friend were part of the search. The roar of the digging machinery behind the old Garrick farm had stopped for a while. Friend Gardner looked pale, ill, and hungover. Ruth doubted if he'd make it through the day when she first saw him. He showed signs of drooping out of his place in the sweep, leaving a hole which could conceivably cause them to overlook the lost boy. Ruth would send him back to Bobby's right away. But he kept up, hungover or not. By then, Ruth herself had already suffered a minor collapse, laboring under the double strain of trying to find David and resist the creeping changes in her own mind. She had snatched 2 hours of uneasy sleep before dawn on Monday morning, then went back out, drinking cup after cup of coffee, and bumming more and more cigarettes. "What? You mean my blanket?" "I am. I am. Thank you, though, for mentioning it." There was no question in her mind of bringing in outside help. If she did, the outsiders would become aware very quickly, within hours, she thought, that Haven had changed its name to Weirdsville. Haven lifestyle, so to speak, rather than the missing boy, would rapidly become the source of their attention, and then David would be lost for good. The heat continued long after sundown. There was distant thunder, but no breeze, no rain. Heat lightning flickered. In the thickets and blowdowns, choked second growth, mosquitoes hummed and buzzed. Branches cracked. Men cursed as they stumbled through wet places or clambered over deadfalls. Flashlight beams zagged aimlessly. There was a sense of urgency, but not of cooperation. There were, in fact, several fistfights before Sunday night, midnight. Mental communication had not fostered a sense of peace and harmony in Haven. In fact, it seemed to have done the exact opposite. Ruth kept them moving as best she could. Then shortly after midnight, early Monday morning, that would have been, the world simply swam away from her. It went fast. I turned my heater off. Like a big fish that looks lazy until it gives a sudden powerful flick of its tail and disappears. She saw the flashlight tumble out of her fingers. It was like watching something suddenly turn chilly. The increasingly vicious headache. Oh, something happened it was like watching something happen in a movie. I skipped a line. She felt the hot sweat on her cheeks and forehead suddenly turn chilly. The increasingly vicious headache that had rocked her all day broke with a sudden, painless pop. She heard this, as if in the center of her brain, someone had pulled a string on a noisemaker. For a moment she could actually see brightly colored crepe streamers, drifting down through the twisting gray channels of her cerebellum. Then her knees buckled. Ruth fell forward into a tangle of shrubs. She could see thorns in the slanted glow of her flashlight, long and cruel-looking, but the bushes felt as comfy as the goose-down pillows. She tried to call out and could not. They heard anyway. Feet approaching, beams crissing and crossing. "Hey! That's enough!" "Thank you." Crissing and crossing. Someone, Judd Tarkington, bumped into someone else, Hank Buck. Momentary hateful exchange flared between them. "You stay out of my way, Strawfoot. I'll thump you with this light, Buck. Swear to God I will. Phoebe! Stop! The gate is open. Just walk your butt in here." Good gracious. And then the thoughts focused on her with real and undeniable, "Love you, Ruth," sweetness. But oh, it was a grasping sweetness, and it frightened her. Hands touched her, turned her over, and we love you, we all love you, and will help you become. Lifted her gently, and I love you too. Now please, find him. Concentrate on that. Concentrate on David Brown. Don't fight. Don't argue. We all love you, Ruth. Lots of parentheses. She saw that some of them were weeping, just as she saw, although she didn't want to, the others snarling, lifting, and drooping their lips, then lifting them again like dogs about to fight. 5. Ad McKean took her home, and Hazel McCready put her to bed. She drifted off into wild, confused dreams. The only one she could remember when she woke up Tuesday morning was the image of David Brown gasping out the last of his life in an almost airless void. He was lying on black earth beneath a black sky filled with glaring stars. Earth was hard and parched and cracked. She saw blood burst from the membranes of his mouth and nose. Saw his eyes burst. And that was when she came awake, sitting up in bed, gasping. She called the town hall. Hazel answered. Just about every other able-bodied man and woman in town was out in the woods, Hazel said, searching. But if they didn't find him by tomorrow, Hazel didn't finish. Ruth rejoined the search. She had now moved 10 miles into the woods. 10 o'clock on Tuesday. Newt Beringer took a look at her and said, "You've got no business being out, Ruth, and you know it." Finished aloud. "It is my business, Newt," she said with an uncharacteristic curtness. "Now leave me alone and get about it." There. Trying to find the next page. She stayed with it all that long, sweltering afternoon, calling until she was too hoarse to speak, and twilight began to come down again. She allowed each Jernigan to ferry her way back to town. There was something under the tarp in the back of Beach's truck. She had no idea what it was, didn't want to know. She wanted desperately to stay in the woods, but her strength was failing. She was afraid that if she collapsed again, they wouldn't let her come back. They would force herself to eat and then sleep 6 hours or so. She made herself a ham sandwich and passed up the coffee. She really wanted a glass of milk. She went up to the schoolroom, sat down, and put her small meal on her desk. She sat looking at her dolls. They looked back at her with their glassy eyes. No more laughing, no more fun, she thought. Quaker meeting has begun. You show your teeth or tongue. The thought drifted away. She blinked, not awake precisely, but back to reality. Sometime later, and looked at her watch. Her eyes widened. She had brought her small meal up here at 8:30. There they still were, near at hand. It was now 11:15, and some of the dolls had been moved around. The German boy in the alpine shorts, lederhosen, was leaning against the F&B lady doll, instead of sitting between the Japanese doll in her kimono and the Indian doll in her sari. Ruth got up, her heart beating too fast and too hard. The Hoppy Kachina doll was sitting on the lap of the burlap Haitian woman, Voodoo doll with white crosses her eyes, and the Russian moss man was lying on the floor, staring at the ceiling, his head wretched to one side like the head of the gallows corpse. Who's been moving my dolls around? Who's been in here? She looked around wildly, and for a moment her frightened, confused mind fully expected to see the child beater Elmer Haney standing in the shadowy space of the big upstairs room that had been Ralph's study, smiling with his sunken, stupid grin. "Told you, woman, you are nothing but a meddling cunt. Nothing. No one. Who's been in here? Who's been moving? We move ourselves, dear. A sly, tittering voice. One hand went to her mouth. Her eyes widened, and then she saw the jagged letters sprawling and lurching across the blackboard. They had been made with so much force that the chalk had broken several times. Untidy chunks of it lay in the chalk gutter. David Brown is on altar 4. What? What? What does that? It means he's gone too far, the Kachina doll said. And suddenly, green light seemed to sweat out of its cottonwood pores. As she looked at it, numb with terror, its wooden face split open in a sinister, yawning grin. A dead cricket fell out of it and struck the floor with a dry desert click. Gone too far. Too far. Too far. No, I don't believe that, Ruth screamed. The whole town, Ruth. Gone too far. Too far. Too far. No! Lost. Lost. The eyes of the grainier papier-mâché doll suddenly filled with that liquid green fire. You're lost too, it said. You're just as crazy as the rest now. David Brown's just an excuse to stay here. No! But all of her dolls were stirring now, that green fire moving from one to the other until her schoolroom flared with that light. It was waxing and waning, and she thought with sick horror that it was just like being inside some ghastly emerald heart. They stared at her with their glazy eyes, and at last she understood why the dolls had frightened Edna Thurlow so badly. Now it was the voices of her dolls rising in that autumn leafy swirl, whispering slyly, rattling among themselves, rattling to her. But these were the voices of the town, too, and Ruth McCausland knew it. She thought they were perhaps the last of the town's sanity, and of her own. Something has to be done, Ruth. It was the china bisque doll, fire dripping from its mouth. It was the voice of Beach Jernigan. Have to warn someone. It was the French poupée, with its ruby gutta percha body. It was the voice of Hazel McCready. But they'll never let you out now, Ruth. It was the Nixon doll, his stuffed fingers raised in twin V's, speaking in the voice of John Enders down at the grammar school. They could. That would be wrong. They love you, Ruth, but if you try to leave now, they'll kill you. You know that, don't you? Her 1910 Cupid doll, with its rubber head like an inverted teardrop. This voice was John Hurd's. Have to send a signal. Signal, Ruth. Yes, and you know how. Use us. We can show you how. We know. She took a shambling step backward, her hands going to her ears, as if she could shut out the voices that way. Her mouth twisted. She was terrified, and what frightened her most was how she ever could have mistaken these voices, with their twisted truths, for sanity. All of Haven's concentrated madness was here, right now. Signal. Use us. We can show you now. We know. And you want to know. Town Hall, Ruth. The clock tower. The rustling voices took up the chant. Town Hall, Ruth. Yes, yes, that's it. The Town Hall. The Town Hall. Yes. Stop it, she screamed. Stop it, oh please, won't you? And then, for the first time since she was 11, and had passed out after winning the girls' mile race at the Methodist summer picnic, Ruth McCausland fainted dead away. 6. Sometime early during the night, she gained a soupy version of consciousness, stumbled downstairs to her bedroom without looking back. She was, in fact, afraid to look back. She was dully aware that her head was throbbing, as it had for the few occasions when she had drunk too much and awkwardly awakened with a hangover. She was also aware that the old Victorian house was rocking and creaking, like an old schooner in heavy weather. While Ruth had lain senseless on the schoolroom floor, terrible thunderstorms rocked central and eastern Maine. A cold front from the Midwest had finally bullied its way into New England, pushing out the still sink of heat and humidity that had covered the area for the last week and a half. The change in the weather was accompanied by terrible thunderstorms in some places. Haven was spared the worst of these, but the power was out again and would remain so for several days this time. But the fact of the power outage wasn't the important thing. Haven had its own unique power sources now. The important thing was simply that the weather had changed. When that happened, Ruth wasn't the only person in Haven to wake up with a terrible hangover sort of headache. Everyone in town, from the oldest to the youngest, woke up feeling the same way as the strong winds blew the tainted air east, sending it out over the ocean, fragmenting it into harmless tatters. 7. Ruth slept until 1 o'clock Wednesday afternoon. She got up with the lingering remains of her headache, but two Anderson took care of that. By 5, she felt better than she had for a long time. Her body ached, and her muscles were stiff, but these were minor matters compared to the things that had troubled her since the beginning of July. That could not cut her into a sense of well-being at all. Her fear for David Brown couldn't spoil it completely. On Main Street, everyone she passed had a peculiar dazed look in his or her eye, as though they had all just awakened from the spell cast by a fairy tale witch. Ruth went to her office in the town hall, enjoying the way the wind lifted her hair from her temples. The way the clouds moved across the sky was a deep, crisp blue. A sky that looked almost autumnal. She saw a couple of kids flying a box kite in the big field behind the grammar school and actually laughed aloud. But there was no laughing later as she spoke to a small group she quickly gathered. Haven's 3 selectmen, town manager, and of course Bryant and Marie Brown. Ruth began by apologizing for not having called the state police and wardens before now, or even reporting the boy's disappearance. She had believed, she said, that they would find David quickly. Probably the first night, certainly the next day. She knew that was no excuse. But it was why she had allowed it to happen. It had been, she said, the worst mistake she had made in her years in as Haven's constable, and if David Brown had suffered for it, she would never forgive herself. Bryant just nodded, dazed and distant and ill-looking. Marie, however, reached across the table and took her hand. "You're not to blame yourself," she said softly. "There were other circumstances. We all know that." The others nodded. "Yes?
Drunk.
What? What about it?"
It was on the floor and VP got hold of it.
Let me see it.
Not the iPod, but the end of the body.
Alright, take that and put it back up there with the others. On top of that black thing.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it just probably fell off. Thank you. We all knew it, the others nodded. "I can't hear their minds anymore," Ruth realized suddenly, and her mind responded. Could you ever, Ruth? Really? Or was it that a hallucination brought by your worry over David Brown? Yes, I could. It would be easier to believe that it had been a hallucination, but that wasn't the truth. In realizing that, she realized something else. She could still do it. It was like hearing a faint roaring sound in a conch shell. That sound children mistake for the ocean. She had no idea what their thoughts were. She was still hearing them. Were they hearing her? "Are you still there?" she shouted as loudly as she could. Marie Bryant's hand went to her temple, as if she could have felt a sudden stab of pain. Newt Barringer frowned deeply. Hazel McCready, who had been doodling on a pad in front of her, looked up as if Ruth had spoken aloud. "Oh, yes. They still hear me." "What happened, right or wrong, is done now," Ruth said. "It's time, and overtime, that I contact the state police about David. Do I have your approval to take this step?" Under normal circumstances, it never would have crossed her mind that she Should ask them a question like that. After all, they paid her pittance of a salary to answer questions, not ask them. But things were different in Haven now. Free breeze and cool, clear air or not, things were still different in Haven now. They looked at her, surprised and a little shocked. Now the voices came back to her clearly. No, Ruth. No. No outsiders. We'll take care. We don't need any outsiders while we become for your life, Ruth. Outside, the wind blew a particularly hard gust, rattling the windows of Ruth's office. Adley McKean looked toward the sound. They all did. Then Adley smiled a puzzled, peculiar little smile. It's time to notify the Stadies. You gotta go ahead. Trust your judgment, don't we? The others agreed. Is somebody outside? Or is the door open? I can hear something on the porch. It's either the door or somebody's outside. Why? Why does this do this? Please do. You gonna be stable? Alright, now we're stable. Did we drop our broadcast? Seems that we did not. Doesn't look like we did. Like we're still going. So we're gonna try this. And if it messes up, then I'll repeat this. Okay? Because it went blank for me. The weather had changed. The wind was blowing, and by Wednesday afternoon, the state police were in charge of the search for David Brown. 8. By Friday, Ruth McCausland understood that Wednesday and Thursday had been an untrustworthy respite in an ongoing process. She was being driven steadily toward some alien madness. A dim part of her mind recognized the fact, bemoaned it, but was unable to stop it. It could only hope that the voices of her dolls held some truth as well as madness. Watching as if from outside herself, she saw her hands take her sharpest kitchen knife, the one she used for boning fish, from the drawer. She took it upstairs into the schoolroom. The schoolroom glowed, rotten with green light, Tommyknocker light. That was what everyone in town was calling them now. It was a good name, wasn't it? Yes, as good as any. The Tommyknockers. Send a signal. That's all you can do now. They want to get rid of you, Ruth. They love you, but their love has turned homicidal. I suppose you can find a twisted sort of respect in that, because they're still afraid of you. Everyone now, even now when you're almost as nutty as the rest of them, they're afraid of you. Maybe someone would hear the signal. Hear it? See it? Understand it. We'll check, make sure the video still. Yes. Okay. Now there was a shaky drawing. 9. Now there was a shaky drawing of a town hall clock tower on her board. The scrawled work of a first grader. Ruth could not stand to work on the dolls in the schoolroom, not in the terrible light that waxed and pulsed. She took them, one by one, into her husband's study, slit their bellies open like a surgeon. The French Madame, 19th century clown, the Cupid, all of them, one by one. And into each she put a small gadget made of C-cells, wires, an electric calculator circuit boards, and a cardboard cores of toilet paper rolls. Yes?
I'm looking for the cutest.
I don't know. Go in there and ask. She sewed the incisions up quickly, using a coarse black thread. As the line of naked dolls grew longer on her husband's desk, they began to look like dead children, victims of some grisly mass poisoning, perhaps, who had been stripped and robbed after death. Each sewn incision parted in the middle so that one of the toilet paper rolls could poke out like the barrel of some old telescope. Only cardboard, the rolls would still serve to channel the force when it was generated. She didn't know how she knew this, or how she had known to build the gadgets in the first place. The knowledge seemed to have come shimmering out of the air. The same air into which David Brown on Altair 4 had disappeared. As she plunged the knife into their plump, defenseless bellies, green light puffed out. I'm sending a signal, murdering the only children I ever had. The signal. The thought of the signal, not the children. She used extension cords to wire the dolls neatly together in a chain. She had stripped the insulation from the last 4 inches of these cords and slipped the gleaming copper into an M16 firecracker she had confiscated from Beach Jernigan's 14-year-old son Hump, thus known because one shoulder rode slightly higher than the other. About a week before all the madness began, she looked back, doubtful for a moment, into her schoolroom with its empty benches. Enough light fell through the archway for her to not be able to see the drawing of the town hall clock tower. She had done it in one of those blank periods that seemed to be getting longer. The hands of the clock in the drawing were set at 3. Ruth set her work aside and went to bed. She slept. But her sleep was not easy. She twisted and turned and moaned. Even in her sleep, the voices ran through her head. Thoughts of revenge planned, cakes to be baked, sexual fantasies, worries about irregularity, ideas for strange gadgets and machines, dreams of power, and below them all, a thin, irrational yammer like a polluted stream. Thoughts coming from the heads of her fellow townspeople, but not human thoughts. And in her nightmarish sleep, that part of Ruth McCausland which clung stubbornly to sanity knew the truth. These were not the rising voices of the people she had lived with all these years, but those of outsiders. They were the voices of the Tommyknockers. Ruth understood by Thursday noon that the change in the weather hadn't solved anything. The state police came, but they did not institute a widespread search. Ruth's report, detailed and complete, as always, made it clear that David Brown, 4, could barely have wandered outside their search area unless he'd been abducted, a possibility they would now have to consider. Her report was accompanied by topographical maps. There were annotated in her careful, no-nonsense handwriting, and made it clear she had conducted the search thoroughly. Careful and thorough you were, Ruthie, Monster Dugan told her that evening. His brow was furrowed in a frown so huge. Each line looked like an earthquake fissure. What's up? Honey, what are you looking for?
The paper application.
We will find it. Right now, I'm not worried about it. Okay, please? Okay. We'll find it. So you can have it for tomorrow. His brow was furrowed in a frown so huge, each line looked like an earthquake fissure. You always have been, but I never knew you to pull a John Wayne stunt like this before. Butch, I'm sorry. Yeah, well, he shrugged. Done is done, huh? Yes, she said and smiled wanly. It was one of Ralph's favorite sayings. Butch asked a lot of questions, but not the one she needed to answer. Ruth, what's wrong in Haven? The high winds had cleansed the town's atmosphere. None of the outsiders sensed anything was wrong. But the winds hadn't ended the trouble. The bad magic was still going on. Whatever it was, it seemed to continue by itself after a certain point. Ruth guessed that point had been reached. She wondered what a team of doctors conducting mass physicals in Haven might find. Iron shortages in women, men with suddenly receding hairlines, improved vision acuity, especially peripheral vision, matched by the surprising high loss of teeth, people who seemed so bright they were spooky, so in tune with you, they almost seemed to be reading your mind. Ruth herself had lost 2 more teeth Wednesday night. One she found on her pillow Thursday morning, a grotesquely middle-aged offering to the tooth fairy. The other was nowhere to be found. She supposed she had swallowed it. Not that it mattered. 11. The compulsion to blow up the town hall became maddening mental poison ivy, itching at her brain all the time. The dog voices whispered and whispered. On Friday, she made the final effort to save herself. She decided to leave town after all. It was not hers anymore. She guessed that staying even this long had been one of the traps the Tommyknockers had laid for her. And, like the David Brown trap, she had blundered into it, confused as a rabbit in a snare. She thought her old dodge wouldn't start. They would have fixed it, but it did. Then she thought she would not be allowed out of Haven Village, that they would stop her, smiling like Moonies, and send their endless, rustly, "We all love you," Ruth thoughts. It wasn't. She rolled down Main Street and out into the country. Ruth sat sitting both upright, white-knuckled, a graven smile on her face, tongue twisters. She sells pickled peppers, bitter butter, flying through her head. She felt her gaze being pulled toward the town hall clock tower. Signal, Ruth. Send. Yes, the explosion, the lovely. Bang, blow it, blow it, blow it, blow it, all the way to Altair 4, Ruth. And resisted with all her might. This compulsion to blow up the town hall to call attention to what was going on here was insane. It was like setting your house on fire to roast a chicken. She felt better when the brick tower was out of sight. On the Dairy Road, she had to resist an urge to get the dart moving as fast as it would go, which, considering its years, was still surprisingly fast. She felt like a lucky escapee from a den of lions, one who had escaped more by good luck than good sense. As the village dropped behind, and those rustling leaves fell away, she began to feel that someone must be giving belated chase. She glanced again and again into the rearview mirror, expecting to see vehicles chasing after her, wanting to bring her back. They would insist that she come back. They loved her too much to let her go. The road had remained clear. No Dick Allison screaming after her in one of the town's 3 fire engines. No Newt Barringer, his big, old, mint green Olds 88. No baby Trayman was in his yellow Challenger. As she approached the Haven Albion town line, she put the dart up to 50. The closer she got to the town line, which she had begun to think of, rightly or not, as the point at which her escape would become irrevocable, the more she found the last 2 weeks seemed like some black, twisted nightmares. Can't go back. Can't. Her foot on the dart's accelerator pedal kept growing heavier. At the end, something warned her. Perhaps it was something the voices had said and her subconscious had filed away. She was, after all, receiving all sorts of misinformation now, sleep, as well as when she was awake. As the town line marker came up, Albion, Albion, just a sign, but it's up and down. Her foot left the dart's gas pedal and stepped on the brake. It went down mushily, much too far, as it had for the last 4 years or so. Ruth allowed the car to roll off the tar and onto the shoulder. Dust, as white and dry as bone meal, plumed up behind her. The wind had died. The air of Haven was deadly still again. The dust she had raised, Ruth thought, would hang for a long time. She sat with her hands curled tightly on the wheel, wondering why she had stopped. Wondering, almost knowing, beginning to become, to know or guess, a barrier. Is that what you think? That they'd put up a barrier? That they've managed to turn all of Haven into an ant farm or something under a bowl? Ruth, that's ridiculous. And so it was, not only according to logic and experience, but also according to the evidence of her senses. As she sat behind the wheel listening to the radio, soft jazz, which was coming from the lower power college station in Bergenfield, New Jersey, a Hillcrest chicken truck, probably bound for dairy, rumbled past her. A few seconds later, a Chevy Vega went by in the other direction. Nancy Voss was behind the wheel. Sticker on the rear bumper read, "Postal workers do it by express mail." Nancy Voss did not look at Ruth, simply went along with her, which in this case probably meant Augusta. See? Nothing stopping them, Ruth thought. No, her mind whispered back. Not them, Ruth. Just you. It would stop you, and it would stop Bobbi Anderson's friend. Maybe one or two others. Go on. Drive right into it at 50 miles an hour or so. If you don't believe it, we all love you. We would hate to see it happen to you. But we couldn't stop it from happening. Instead of driving, she got out and walked up to the Haven Albion line. Her shadow trailed along behind her. The hot July sun beat down on their head. She could hear the dim but steady rumble of machinery from the woods behind Bobby's place. Digging again. The David Brown vacation was over, and she sensed that it was getting close to something. This brought a sense of panic and urgency. She approached the marker, passed it, walking, began to feel a wild, rising hope. She was out of Haven. She was in Albion. In a moment she would run screaming to the nearest house, nearest telephone. She flowed. A puzzled look settled upon her face, and then deepened into a dawning, horrified certainty. It was getting hard to walk. The air was becoming tough, springy. She could feel it stretching her cheeks, skin on her forehead. She could feel it flatten her breast. Ruth lowered her head and continued to walk, her mouth drawn down in a grimace of effort, cords standing out on her neck. She looked like a woman trying to walk into a gale-force wind, although the trees on either side of the road were barely swaying their leaves. The image which had come to her now, the one which had come to Gardner when he tried to reach into the bottom of Anderson's custom water heater, were exactly the same. They differed only by degree. Ruth felt as if the entire road had been blocked by an invisible nylon stocking, one large enough to fit a female Titan. I've heard about nude look hose, she thought hysterically, but really, this is ridiculous. Give me the page. I'm going to eat you. Give me the page. Oh, I guess it looked like it was 2 pages, but it is actually 1. Okay. Anyway. Her breasts began to ache from the pressure. Suddenly, her feet began to slip in the dirt. Panic slapped at her. She had reached and passed the point where her ability to degenerate forward motion surpassed the elastic give of the invisible barrier. Now it was shoving her back out. She struggled to turn, to get out of on her own before that could happen, but she lost her footing and was snapped rapidly back the way she had come, her feet scrambling, her eyes wide and shocked. It was like being paused by the expanding side of a large rubbery balloon. It was like being pushed by the expanding size of a large rubbery balloon. For a moment, her feet left the ground entirely, and then she landed on her knees, scraping them both badly, tearing her dress. She got up, back toward her car, crying a little with the pain. She sat behind the wheel of the car for almost 20 minutes, waiting for the throbbing in her knees to subside. Cars and trucks passed occasionally along Dairy Road in both directions. And once as she sat there, Ashley Ruvel came along on his bike. He had his fishing pole. He saw her and raised a hand to her. Hi, Mrs. McCausland, he cried chirpily and grinned. The list wasn't really surprising, he thought dully, considering that all of the boys' teeth were gone. Not some, all. Still, she felt coldness rush through her as Ashley called, "We love you, Mrs. McCausland." Make sure it's still broadcasting. Hopefully you guys didn't miss anything. All right. After a long time, she backed the dart up, U-turned, and went back through the hot silence to Haven Village. As she drove up Main Street to her house, it seemed that a great many people looked at her, their eyes full of knowledge, more sly than wise. Ruth looked up into the dark rearview mirror, saw the clock tower at the other end of the village's short Main Street. The hands were approaching 3 o'clock. She pulled to a stop in front of Fannon's, bumping carelessly up over the curb and stalling the engine. She didn't bother to turn off the key. She only sat behind the wheel, red idiot lights glowing on the instrument panel, and looking into the rearview mirror as her mind floated gently away. When she came back to herself, the town hall was chiming 6. She had lost 3 hours and another tooth. The hours were nowhere to be found, but the tooth and its incisor lay on its lap in her dress. 12. All that night her dolls talked to her. She thought that none of what they said was precisely a lie. That was the most horrible thing of all. She saw in the green, deserted heart of their influence and listened. She sat in the green, diseased heart of their influence and listening to them all tell their lunatic fairy tales. They told her she was right to believe she was crazy. An X-ray of her brain, they said, one of anyone in Haven, for that matter, would make a neurologist run screaming for cover. Her brain was changing. It was coming. Her brain, her teeth, oh, excuse me, that was X-teeth, both becoming, and her eyes, they were changing color, weren't they? Yes. Their deep browns are fading toward hazel. And the other day in the Haven lunch, hadn't she noticed that Beach Jernigan's bright blue eyes were also changing color, deepening toward hazel? Hazel eyes, no teeth. Oh, dear God, what's happening to her? The dolls looked at her glassily and smiled. Don't worry, Ruth. It's only the invasion of space. They've made cheap movies about for years. Blah, blah, blah. They've made movies about for years. You see that, don't you? Invasion of the Tommyknockers. You want to see the invaders from space? The B movies, science fiction stories we're always going to on about? Look in Beach Jernigan's or Wendy's or your own. What do you mean? What you mean is that I'm being eaten up? She whispered in the summer darkness as Friday night became Saturday morning. Why, Ruth, what do you think becoming was? What did you think? The dolls laughed and Ruth's mind mercifully floated away once again. 13. Yeah, we've only got about 10 pages left, so we're doing good. 13. When she woke up on Saturday morning, the sun was up. Shaky child's drawing of the town hall clock tower was on the schoolroom blackboard. And there was better than 2 dozen calculators on Ralph's sheeted study desk. They were in the canvas shoulder bag she used when she went out collecting for the Cancer Society. There were diatoms on some of the calculators: Behringer, McCready, Selectman's Office, Do Not Remove, Department of Taxes. She hadn't gone to sleep after all. Instead, she had drifted into one of those blank periods and looted all the town's officers' calculators. It looked like, why, Yours not to reason why, Ruth, the dolls whispered, and she understood better and better each day, better and better each minute, each second, in fact. She had frightened little Edwina Thoreau so badly. Yours is but to send a signal and die. How much of that idea is mine? How much is them driving me? Doesn't matter, Ruth said. It's going to happen anyway. So make it happen as fast and hard and soon as you can. Stop thinking. Let it happen. Because part of you wants it to happen, doesn't it? Yes, most of her, in fact. But not to send a signal to the outside world or be silly bullshit like that. That was just the same icing on the rich devil's food cake in irrationality. She wanted to be part of it as it had all went up. The cardboard tubes would channel the force and send it up into the clock tower in a bright river destructive power. And the tower that lifted off like a rocket. Shockwave would hammer the streets of this fouled haven with destruction. Destruction was what she wanted. Was that what? Destruction was what she wanted. That want was part of her becoming. 14. That night, Butch Dugan called her to update her on the David Brown case. Some of the developments were unusual. The boy's brother, Hillman, was in the hospital in a state of which closely resembled catatonia. The kid's grandfather wasn't much better. He had been telling people that David Brown hadn't been gotten lost, but had actually disappeared. But the magic trick, in other words, had been real. And Butch said he was telling anyone who would listen that half the people in Haven were going crazy and the rest already were already there. He went up to Bangor and talked to a fellow named Bright on the news, Monster said. They wanted his human interest and got nut stuff instead. Old man's turning into a real Khazar, Ruth. Better tell him to stay away, Ruth said. They'll let him in, but he'll never get out again. What? Monster shouted. Her voice was suddenly becoming faint. This connection's going to hell, Ruth. I said there may be something new tomorrow. I still haven't given up hope. She rubbed her temples steadily, then looking at the dolls in a row on Ralph's desk and wired up a terrorist bomb. Look for the signal tomorrow. What? Monster's voice was almost lost in the rising surf of the worsening connection. Goodbye, Butch. You're a hell of a sport. Listen for it. You'll hear it all the way to Derry, I think. 3 on the nose. Ruth, I'm losing you. Call back soon. She hung up the useless phone, looked at her dolls, listening to their rising voices, and waited for it to be mine. Oh, waited for it to be time. Oh my God, how did I mess that up? Listening to the rising voices and waited for it to be time. My Lord, my eyes are going to go boo and buggy. I'm not going to be able to do much. But I'd like to finish this chapter. All right, ready? 15. That Sunday was a picture book summer day in Maine. Clear, bright, warm. At 1:45, Ruth McCausland, dressed in a pretty blue summer frock, left her house for the last time. She locked the front door and stood on tiptoe to hang the key on the little hook there. Ralph had argued that any burglar worth his salt would look over the door for a key first thing of all. Holy crap. Door for a key first thing of all. But Ruth had gone on doing it, and the house had never been burgled. She supposed, at bottom, came down to trust. Haven had never let her down. She had put the dolls in Ralph's old canvas duffel. She dragged it down the porch steps. Bobby Trayman was walking by, whistling. Can I help you with that, Mrs. McCausland? No, thank you, Bobby. All right, he smiled at her. A few teeth were left in his smile, not many, but a few, like the last remaining pickets in a fence surrounding a haunted house. We all love you. Yes, she said, hoisting the duffel bag into the passenger seat. A bolt of pain ripped through her head. Oh, well, I know it. What are you thinking, Ruth? Where are you going? She sells seashells. She sells seashells. Tell us, Ruth. Tell us what the dolls told you to do. Betty Bitter bought some butter. Give Ruth, tell us it. What we want, or are you holding out? Wouldn't you like to know, Peter Piper, what we want, isn't it? There's no changes, are there? He looked at Bobby for a moment and then smiled. Bobby Trayman's own smile faltered a little. Love me, yes, but you are all still afraid of me, and are right to be. Go on, Bobby, she said softly, and Bobby went. He looked back over his shoulder once, his young face trembled mistrusting. Ruth drove to the town hall. It was a Sunday, silent, a dusty church of administration. Her footfalls clicked and echoed. The duffel, too heavy to carry, so she dragged it along the waxed hall floor. It made a dry, snake-like hiss. She hauled it up 3 flights of stairs, one riser at a time, her hands fisted around the cord that shut the duffel's mouth. Her hand pumped and ached. She bit her lip, and 2 teeth peeled out sideways with soft rottenness. She spat them out. Her breath was harsh straw in her throat. Dusty sunlight fell through the high third floor windows. She dragged the bag down the short, explosively hot corridor. There were only 2 rooms up here, one on each side. All the town's records were stored in them. The town hall was Haven's brain. Then here, in this still attic heat, was its proper paper memory, stretching back through the times the town had been Illuim, Montgomery, Cottersville, Montville Plantation. The voices whispered and rustled around her. For a moment, she stood looking out at the last window, looking down the short length of Main Street. There were maybe 15 cars parked in front of Cooter's Market, which was open from noon to 6 on Sundays. In front of Carter's Market, it was doing a brisk business. People sauntering into the Haven lunch for coffee, a few cars passing back and forth. It looks so normal. It all looks so damn normal. She felt a giddy moment of doubt, and then Moose Richardson looked up and waved, as if he could see her, looking out of his dirty third floor window. And Moose wasn't the only one. Lots of them were looking at her. She ducked back, turned, got the window pole, which stood at the far corner, where the hall dead ended. Okay. She used the pole to hook a ring in the middle of the ceiling and pop down the folding stars. That done, she set the pole aside and went back. Looking up into the tower, she could hear the mechanical rattle and whir clockwork. Below that, the dim rustling of sleeping bats. There were a lot of them, close. My place. My brain is... That done, she set the pole aside and bent back, looking up into the tower. She could hear the mechanical rattle and whirl of clockwork, and below that, the dim rustle of sleeping bats. There were a lot of them up there. The town should have cleaned them out years ago. But the fumigation was apt to be nasty and expensive. When the clock machinery broke down again, the bats would have to be cleared out before it could be fixed. That would surely be soon enough. As far as the selectmen were concerned, as long as someone else is in office, when the clock rang 12 noon, some night at 3 in the morning, and then just stopped, all would be well. Okay then. Ruth wound the duffel's cotton cord around her arm 3 times and began to climb slowly up the ladder, dragging the bag behind her legs. It bumped and rose and jerks like a body on a canvas sack. The cord bit into her arm ever more deeply, and soon her hand had gone purple and numb. She breathed in long, tearing gasps that hurt something deep inside her chest. At last, shadows enveloped her. She stepped off the ladder and into the town hall's real attic, and pulled the duffel bag up, hand over hand. Ruth was dimly aware that her gums and ears had started to bleed, and her mouth, full of that sour, coppery taste of blood. All around her she could smell the crypt stink of old brick fuming in dry, dank, pent-up summer heat. To her left was a vain, dim circle, the backside of that clock face which overlooked Main Street. In a more prosperous town, no doubt all 4 sides would have had a face. Haven's town hall tower had only the one. It was 12 feet in diameter. Okay. It was only 12 feet in diameter. Behind it, dimmer yet, she could see wheels and cogs slowly turning. She could see where the hammer come down and strike the bell. The dent there was deep and ancient. The clock's works were very loud. Working swiftly, jerkily, she was like a clock herself now, a clock that was running down, and her belfry certainly full of bats, wasn't it? Ruth unwound the cotton cord from her arm, from her arm, actually peeling it out of its deep, swirling groove in her flesh, and opened the mouth of the duffel. She began to taking the dolls out one by one, moving as fast as she could. She laid them in a circle, legs out so that you could feel maintained contact all around the circle. In the circle, like all around the circle. Okay. Hands the same way. In the darkness, they looked like dolls conducting a seance. That's funny. She attached the M16 to the center of the dental place on the great hall bell. When the hour struck and the hammer fell, boom! So I just want it here, she thought. Sit here. I want to sit here. Sit here and wait for the hammer to fall. Droning weariness suddenly washed over her. Ruth drifted away. 16. She came back slowly. At first she thought she must be in bed at home, with her face pressed into the pillow. She was in bed, and all this was just had been a terrible nightmare, except her pillow was not this bristly, this hot. Her blankets did not pulse and breathe. She brought her hands up and touched a hot, leathery body, bones covered with scant flesh. The bats had roosted just above her right breast. In the hollow of her shoulder, she realized suddenly that she had called it That somehow she had called all of them. She could hear its rodentine, scabrous mind, its thoughts dark and instinctual and insane. It thought only of blood and bugs and cruising in blind darkness. Oh God, no, she screamed.